Hello, everybody, and welcome to the briefing room. And today we are talking about the Spanish Republicans that joined the British Army in World War II. And to help me with that is the author of this book, Churchill's Spaniards, Séan Scullion. Séan, welcome to the briefing room.
Hi, John. Yes, a real pleasure to be on your program. Thanks for inviting me.
Oh, you're very welcome. And this was awesome. This was a really, really good read. I didn't know anything about this at all. And it was really, really interesting.
Yeah,
And
I mean, it's a story that's not very well known, so it's always good to get people to kind of find out that there's more to things than you think, if you know what I mean.
yeah, this is what I try and do with the show. I try and highlight stuff that's not really talked about. And, it's there's a lot of heroes out there that nobody knows anything about. So,
Exactly.
I
I mean,
need to be
obviously,
highlighted.
to their families, they are heroes, but there
Yeah.
are some of them who definitely went beyond, above and beyond. So we'll talk about that later.
Yeah, of course. What inspired you to write about Churchill's Spaniards?
Well, I have a Spanish background. I was brought up in Spain as a child during the last years of the dictatorship of Francisco Franco, and I did a degree in Spanish. And basically, I've been involved in Spanish matters for some time. Being a bilingual speaker, I kind of can flip between the two languages quite easily. And the book, The Churchill Spaniards, has now been published in Spain. The book was published in the UK in 2024, and in 2025 it was published in Spain. So Spanish is kind of writ large upon my life. It's quite a
Yeah.
quite a big deal. And basically, this story really comes from various kind of points, really, where I've been heavily involved in military history over the last 25 years, because I'm still a serving officer in the British Army. Heavily involved with Royal Engineers, Historical Society. I'm a Royal Engineer officer. Also heavily involved in the Peninsular Wars and stuff to
Wow.
do with that period. I was heavily involved in the bicentenary commemorations of the Peninsular Wars between 2008 and 2014. And then really, I've always had a love of Spanish history, obviously, for obvious reasons, and also been heavily involved in visiting Spanish Civil War battlefields. And it all
Mhm.
came to a head, really. There were two turning points, really, that made me decide to write the book. First of all, I started to get into the research, basically because I got sent a copy of a book by a Spanish author called Los Españoles de Churchill, Churchill Spaniards in Spanish, in the 1980s. Daniel Arasa, he's still alive, he's in his late 80s. I've met him a few times, really nice man. And he wrote a story about Spaniards in the British Armed Forces during the Second World War, but he didn't have the access that I had because a lot of the archives hadn't been opened up properly. He did though, however, interview some of these men who were still alive in the 80s. So I missed out on that because there are none of them left alive, sadly. But yeah, so that kind of got me going, and that really then, and one thing led on to another. I started interviewing people, then started to meet families, and as a consequence, after 8 years of research, I wrote the book. But what really made me want to write the book was actually speaking on another podcast. We Have Ways of Making You Talk. I got invited on that
Mm.
in 2021, and I'd already amassed a lot of research, and I'd already started writing a lot of this down. And that basically made me think if this is of interest to people, then I definitely should write a book. So I then spent the next 2.5 to 3 years finishing off the writing and getting the chapters and the book brought together, and then basically searched for a publisher, which was quite hard because obviously I've never written a book. I've written some books before, but not in this sphere.
Yeah.
I've written quite a lot of military stuff for military journals and things like that. I've
Mhm.
also, back in the 90s, I was involved in the teaching of Spanish. I was a secondary school teacher involved in A-level writing of A-levels, and I was also a lecturer, university lecturer for a bit. And I ended up writing textbooks for GCSE and A-level Spanish.
Mhm.
So I do know how to write. It's not,
Mhm.
it's not. But obviously the whole military history thing was a new venture for me. But we got there eventually. We got the publisher, Helium, were very good, and we got the book out there in 2024, in September 2024, and it's been non-stop ever since, really, to be
Yeah.
honest.
And did anything really surprise you when you were doing your research?
Everything, basically everything. First of all, just to kind of find out that there were over 1,000, I reckon there's about 1,200 Spaniards who served in the British Army.
Mm.
The fact that there were so many, you know, it's an incredible story. And also the fact that they served in so many different parts of the army, that's another amazing story. And the fact that they also served in different campaigns in different countries. We're talking about from the Middle East all the way to the Western Mediterranean, across the whole of North Africa, Italy, Northwest Europe, Normandy, Britain, and
Yeah.
I've even managed. It's not in the book, but there are a few of them who ended up in Burma, and there are also. I mentioned it in the book. There are also quite a few who fought the Italians in Eritrea, Somalia, Ethiopia. So they really did get heavily involved. So the big surprises were just basically going from one thing to another and opening up all these rabbit holes and going down them and then finding all this information. And the big thing is that I am still being surprised daily, weekly at least, sometimes daily, because families get in touch. So since I wrote the book in English, I've had probably another 30 or 40 families get in touch. I've interviewed over 120 families now.
Mm-hmm.
Whose grandfather, great uncle, great grandfather, whatever, has served, and therefore I'm still surprised by all these new openings that keep appearing, and obviously a lot of them knew each other, but then through the ages, through the generations, the contacts have kind of started to break up a bit. And that's one of the reasons why, as a consequence of writing the book, in the last couple of months, we've re-established the Spanish Ex-Servicemen's Association. But we'll talk about that a bit later on. So yeah, so loads of surprises, huge surprises, like, for example, finding out that there were 15 Spaniards in the SAS, for example. There were Spaniards who were in the Special Forces, in the Commandos. There were Spaniards in the Special Operations Executive. There were Spaniards that served in North Africa and who were on D-Day, Spaniards in Arnhem, I mean, there are lots of surprises. And if you look through the book, the idea of the book is it's an introduction, really. I've got lots of other projects that I will continue to do in the future. And this book's really just the starting point. It's to give everybody a starting point, especially if people are relatives. They can find their relative in the book, especially in the back, because that's where they've got the list of all the Spaniards I've listed. I was really keen to make sure that every single Spaniard that served that I found so far in the archives was listed in the book. And therefore people can then start to find out more if they don't know already.
Yeah, you talked about a few things there. They really surprised me. I'll talk about them in just a sec, but a lot of things were like, oh my God, really? Really? That's what it was like just going through your book. And starting with the defeat of the Spanish Republic, how did that set the Spaniards on the path to fighting with the British?
Well, it's a long and arduous journey. We're talking about 500,000 Spaniards, more or less, 480,000 or so, that escaped across the Pyrenees or to North Africa when the Spanish Civil War was finished. And most people don't realize, but the Spanish Civil War finished in March, April 1939. And only a few months later, the Second World War started. So we're talking about something that was very sort of raw for the Spaniards to go from one conflict to another. The majority, over 400,000, were in France. So we're talking about most of those being put into internment camps, especially the men of a fighting age. And then when war is approaching, the French realize that they need a lot of these people for their war machine. So what they do is they start to recruit a lot of the Spaniards to fight in the French equivalent of the Pioneer Corps, these Compagnies de Travailleurs Étrangers. And also they opened up the doors to the French Foreign Legion. And also they established, because there was such a need for fighting troops, they also established these régiments de volontaires, régiments de marche de volontaires étrangers. So these volunteer marching foreign marching battalions and regiments. And a lot of the Spaniards joined that. And by the time we get to the autumn of 1940, when the war has been declared, we're talking about over 75, nearly 80,000 Spaniards of the right age, 18 to 40, are serving one way or another in the French armed forces, mostly in any of those three categories. But also there were several tens of thousands who also worked in munitions factories and things like that. And it's really with the fall of France in 1940 that the Spanish first start to cut across to the British. In fact, with the British expeditionary force that arrived in France in the autumn of 1939, talking about the need for lots of labour to support the British expeditionary force, and that's when the first Spaniards start to serve with the British. There were three pioneer companies as such who were transferred over from the French, and one of them in particular, the 185th Company, was transferred to Saint-Nazaire and supported the Pioneer Corps and several other units in the Saint-Nazaire area, in the rear area of the British Expeditionary Force. And quite a few of those ended up then serving the British Army a few months later. So we've already got a lot of them looking at supporting the British. Quite a few of them in their roles with the French also supported the British once the fighting started in France in May, June 1940. They got caught up in the turmoil of Blitzkrieg. Several of the Spaniards were in companies on the Maginot Line. Many of them fought up there. The Régiment de Marche de Volontaires Étrangers were also up there. They were also in the area, in the Champagne area. Many of them were killed. A lot of them were made prisoners of war initially. And when the Germans then approached Franco, he said, don't worry about them. They can, you don't need to, we don't want them, kind of thing. And basically their prisoner of war status was taken away from them. And quite a few of those then ended up in Mauthausen concentration camp. And it's well documented, over 4,000, around 4,000 Spaniards were murdered in Mauthausen or the surrounding camps. Mauthausen being the largest concentration camp of its type for the Nazi regime. I visited there for the first time a few months ago. It was very touching to see such a huge Spanish contingent, because we're talking about 8 to 10,000 Spaniards who were sent to concentration camps, who had been captured during that period in 1940. A lot of the other Spaniards who were captured or amongst the defeated French, they were then subsumed into things like the Pod Group, the company that was set up to do a lot of the construction for the Nazi regime. And they ended up building things like, for example, the submarine pens in Bordeaux and Saint-Nazaire and places like Lorient, places like that, as well as a lot of the defences of the Atlantic Wall in the Channel Islands, for example. There were several hundred Spaniards who were in the Channel Islands. And if the Spaniards were in the Vichy zone, they were lucky, like a lot of other people in the Vichy zone. They weren't taken over by the Germans. And quite a few of them, they just melted into the background and became members of the resistance, the Maquis. But the first lot of Spaniards that basically joined the British Army, there's two groups, really. There's a group that joins up in Britain, and there's a group that joins up in the Middle East. The group that joins up in Britain are mostly made up of just over 300 Spaniards who have been serving the French Foreign Legion. They've been fighting in Narvik in April, May 1940. They arrive in Britain after being in France very briefly. Arrive in Britain, I think they land in Plymouth about the 20th or so of June, and then they're sent to Trenton Park, not very far from where you're originally from, from Stoke. They end up being housed there with the other French Foreign Legion and other troops that have been evacuated from France or from other parts of the world. And they're basically visited by de Gaulle. And on the day they are visited by de Gaulle, they go in protest and say they do not want to serve with the French anymore because they regard the French as having lost the war. They want to continue fighting and they want to serve with the British army. The French don't know what to do with them. They're then taken to Stafford Prison, held in Stafford Prison for a few days. And then on the 1st of July, they're forced to go to Avonmouth to get on a ship that's then going to go back to North Africa. And of course, a lot of the Spaniards are really troubled by this, because they think they're just basically going to be sent to slave labor camps or worse, back to Spain. So there's a huge protest at Avonmouth Harbour. big standoff, and the British intervene, and around 300 Spaniards are able to join the British Army that summer, and another 30 or 40 so join over the course of the next 6 months as well. And about 15 of those come from the 185th Company that have been serving in Saint-Nazaire. They eventually end up joining the British Army as well. So they're the first wave, and they joined the Pioneer Corps and established the #1 Spanish Company that is established in Plymouth in September 1939. And at the same time as that, there are French Foreign Legionnaires and members of these volunteer marching battalions, volunteer foreign marching battalions in the Middle East. And several hundred Spaniards are in these, in one battalion in particular, and in the French Foreign Legion. And they have the same problem. They don't want to serve with the French anymore. In fact, the French of the Levant are initially going to go across to the British, but the decision is made by the governor, who's a French general, not to join Vichy France instead. And a lot of the Spaniards revolt. Many of them are put in prison in Homs and Aleppo, names that we know well from the recent Syrian war. Over 75 are able to escape, desert from the French Foreign Legion and the foreign marching battalions, and cross the desert to Jordan and Palestine to join the British Army in Egypt, and then become the first recruits and the first soldiers of the newly established Middle East Commandos, the 50th number 50 Middle East Commandos, established in August, September 1940. So those are the two waves. And then the second wave is further down the line, when lots of Spaniards are liberated from concentration and labor camps in North Africa in 1942, 1943. They're the biggest wave of Spaniards. It also coincides with quite a lot of Spaniards who've been in penal colonies, having been in the French Foreign Legion, or whose contracts are coming up for renewal, so they decide not to bother, or who actually just desert from the French Foreign Legion and join the British Army. And over 700 Spaniards joined the British Army in North Africa from the end of 1942 onwards. So that's how they end up in the British Army.
And I was really surprised that they actually fight in Dunkirk.
Yeah, I mean, they're not fighting for the British at that point. They're fighting with the French, but they are part of a series of labor companies, pioneer companies, that are supporting the French. And in fact, several of the Spaniards in those companies take up arms and fight the Germans in the final battle for Dunkirk. And quite a lot of those are the ones that end up also in Mauthausen further down the line. And obviously, I mentioned it in the book, there's several stories of some of the Spaniards managing to escape over to Britain at Dunkirk. Sadly, quite a lot of them end up being sent back to France, because obviously the French continued fighting for another 3 weeks after Dunkirk. So we're not talking about the capitulation of France totally. It's just that bit on the French-Belgian border that's fallen, and the rest of France is still fighting, and therefore the French send their people back to France to carry on fighting. So a lot of those Spaniards who go back end up in many ways, sadly, back in the camps they started at in March, April, May 1939, when they finished the Spanish Civil War and cross over to France, which is very sad. Some of them are able to kind of carry on and do stuff and fight, but many of them don't. But there are several. There's several examples, amazing stories of things going on, of daring do and people sort of rowing across the channel and things like that. It's an amazing story.
Yeah, there is some amazing stories in there. It's like I said at the beginning, there's a lot of heroes out there that need a mention.
Yeah, there's quite a few. Yeah, and they are very persistent. They are people who are able to keep going, which is, I find, amazing, especially when they've already lost one war. How do you keep going? It's a huge thing mentally as well as physically.
Why were the British reluctant at first to have Spanish Republicans in their army?
I don't think it was necessarily due to the politics initially. When we're talking about things like Dunkirk, there was a huge issue across the whole of Britain about fifth columnists and all of the things that were going on. Because France was falling, the Low Countries had fallen, all of that. France was in the throes of falling as well in June 1930, June 1940, and therefore when a lot of non-Brits turned up in Britain, there was a reluctance to kind of allow them. You only have to think about a lot of the Jewish being housed in the Isle of Man, for example, at the beginning of the war. Well, the Spaniards were regarded in the same kind of way. So there were lots of issues there with that. Of course, yes, there were political issues. They were regarded as Reds, and ironically, the irony is that a lot of the Spaniards who served the British Army weren't communists. A lot of them were actually anarchists. And the irony of that is not lost on me. A lot of these were anarchists and really were ardent anarchists, and they were willing to serve with the British Army and and swear an allegiance to the king. So that's quite impressive, really, in itself. But also, you've got to remember that a lot of the socialist stroke communist elements of the Republican side, that's where a lot of the money was, and therefore they did look after their own a lot better. So a lot of the anarchists were they literally had to muddle through and try and kind of sort themselves out. They were left out in the dark, in the cold quite a bit. But when it came to the British taking on a lot of these people, I think at the beginning of the war, especially after Dunkirk, there were issues, like I say, but I think it was also a bit of a needs must as well to a certain extent. And by 1942, it definitely was a needs must. The British Army did have a huge manning crisis, and it did need people to serve in the British Army and to support the fighting troops. You have this big logistic tail that army has, especially the armies of Montgomery, etc. Fighting troops. There weren't that many, and there were a lot of people to support them. So basically, it was really important to have a lot of that. And when you had a lot of people that were willing and able to serve, to volunteer to serve in the British Army, albeit just as maybe pioneers, that was they had their arms ripped off basically, and they proved themselves. But a lot of them did transfer out of the Pioneer Corps and do other things as well, as we'll talk about. But there were a few issues. I mean, especially with, for example, we talk a little bit about the Spaniards who from the #1 Spanish company who ended up training as members of the Special Operations Executive. Some of them ended up being SOE agents and doing work with them. Not all of them though, because they weren't all needed. But there was always a bit of an issue with these people. They're quite left-wing leaning. Is it easy? How easy is it? And the irony, of course, is that Kim Philby was one of the people who trained them. So that's a funny old story in itself. So there were a few issues there, but overall, I think just like any other element of the British Army, we were willing to take them on, and a lot of their officers spoke very highly of them and about their loyalty and their hard work. And I've tracked down 3 who were awarded a military medal and things like that. So we know that they did well. So of course, like every other part of the army, there were some scoundrels. I talk about that in the book a bit. Having now been able to get hold of more army records, that quite a few of them did really well. Some of them were still, but just like any other soldier, you get good soldiers and bad soldiers. So not as if it's if they were all bad apples. It was all a real mix. Like you get in any other part of the army. So I mean, I think a real mix of politics to a certain extent. And there are mentions of that in Hansard, with the do we take these people on because they are Republicans, blah blah blah.
Yeah.
But as I say, needs must, I think.
Who ultimately pushed for their recruitment?
Well, I think firstly, when we've got the troops that arrive in the UK, there were 2 or 3 reasons really. One of the reasons, ironically, was because the French Foreign Legion commanders were actually told, "Oh, shoot 1 out of every 3, just to make sure that they're going to comply." Well, as soon as the British heard about that, they went, "No, we'll take them on. Thank you very much." And it's quite obvious that there were British intelligence officers who were sent to interview a lot of these people, and there were no issues with any of them as far as they were concerned, and therefore it was fairly straightforward. So yes, they were taken on. The British kind of felt obliged to take those people on. When it came to the ones in the Middle East, the ones who eventually became the Middle East Commandos, well, and just like the ones who were already in Britain as well, they were already people who'd already fought with France against the Germans. So, we're talking about, and also people who fought in the Spanish Civil War. So we're talking about people who are actually, quite experienced against Blitzkrieg, etc., etc. When the French saw the way that the Spaniards fought in Narvik, they realized, okay, they might be left-wing leaning, and they might look after each other a lot more than people would do if they were in the Foreign Legion, and they don't necessarily follow orders like we want, rigid discipline, blah blah blah. But my goodness, can they fight? So I think knowing that, the British were quite happy to take these people on, and there's some really good examples of how the British really appreciated the work that they were doing. Middle East Commandos is a prime example. That's in chapter 4 of the book. You can see a lot of stuff about how well they did, especially night operations. They were really good at night operations and everything else. They were used extensively against the Italians in Abyssinia, Ethiopia, and Eritrea. And Somalia, they did really well in those locations. So they did well, and some of those in the Middle East Commandos carried on fighting all the way through to the end of the war. Some of them in the SAS, some of them in the infantry. So these were people that were respected. And therefore there were no issues with that. When it comes to the others, the ones that were recruited in North Africa, by then they really did need the manpower. So there was a very much a front foot kind of, okay, we need these people to enlist. We're going to give them some options, see what they say, and all of that. So that really was important. Some of them were actually taken out of the camps early to fight behind the lines in Tunisia, for example, because they were people that had already had a lot of experience as guerrillas, etc., during the Spanish Civil War. So a lot of these people were seen as important. So some of them, having already served in the French Foreign Legion, no sooner had they joined the British Army in the Pioneer Corps, they transferred to other parts of the army. Prime example, a big gang of them joined the SAS, went for SAS selection and joined the SAS. So there was definitely a pull from the British side when it came to the recruiting from the end of 1942 onwards.
And how quickly did they adapt to British military culture?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, they adapted pretty well. The issue they had was the language. So they really did have a bit of a language issue. I mean, the irony is that if we rewind back to 1939 and the spring of 1939, we're talking April, May 1939. There were several British delegations that visited the camps in southern France. And at that point, before the French really started to recruit people from the camps, a lot of the Spanish Republican Army was in its units and brigades in the camps. So they were all still together. And there were several delegations from the UK that visited these camps, and they ended up being approached by the senior commanders of the Republican Army and asked, look, we would really like to serve. We know there's a war coming. We would happily serve with the British Army, and we could be a foreign legion as such if you wanted us to be. Yeah. So this foreign legion was put forward as a proposal by the Republican Army via various politicians and people who knew the Republican movement well, through the House of Commons and the House of Lords. And there were two proposals. One proposal was made that a 50,000 strong foreign legion was sent to Egypt and supported the British in Egypt, army based. And then the second proposal was that the Republican Air Force pilots, and there were around 180 aircrew, would happily join the RAF, both were given a no by the British. As you know, the Air Ministry and the rest of the armed forces were different. The Admiralty, Air Ministry, and the Army, and they independently they said no. And the irony, of course, is that if they had said yes, then the Spaniards probably would have been similar in size to the initial elements that you had of the Poles and people like that started to serve with the British in Egypt and everything else. Obviously, that didn't happen in the end. So assimilation never really happened in that way. The way it worked really was the British decided not to allow anything larger than company-sized group. Around 250 was the largest amount of Spaniards that were in any one location, one unit as such, subunit in this case, a company. And they were basically told to sort out their own NCOs, so definitely corporal and below, in some cases sergeant and below, so that basically the organization could run more smoothly. And the British saw this as a way of being able to basically manage the Spaniards a lot better, because the French had the same problem. And what the French had done with the Compagnie de Travailleurs Étrangers, these pioneer companies, they had basically allowed a Spanish officer to be like the second in command or the third in command, and then Spanish NCOs to run the sections or small troops within, but then have junior officers and senior NCOs, senior non-commissioned officers that were French, running the show. And the British kind of realised that worked quite well. And of course, the Spaniards were not the only aliens, as they were called, joining the British Army at the time. You had a lot of German speakers, you had Eastern European speakers, you had French, you even had North Africans, you had Palestinians, you had Cypriots. There were, the Spaniards were just one of many groups that were volunteering to join the British Army, predominantly in the Pioneer Corps. But then they went on to serve in other parts as well, like I keep saying. So assimilating was difficult, but ironically, by the end of the war, most of them good English, really good English, especially those who were NCOs, extremely good English. I've tracked down. I don't mention it in the book, but I found recently a document that says there were 6 of them who became officers. That's my next little project, is to find out who these 6 officers were. They definitely would have had to have spoken English well. So we've got proof that there were several of them who assimilated very well, and most of them that were released in Britain had no issues. A lot of them married British women and settled down in Britain, so not too much of an issue. Still regarded as aliens at the end of the war. A lot of them were given the opportunity to become British after 1947, which is good, and a lot of them did, and quite a few of them didn't. But assimilating into the British Army was not too much of a problem.
Mm-hmm. And can I just go to North Africa for a second? What were the conditions like in the Saharan camps that they were kept in?
Horrendous. There are several. I was in March. I was in Alicante in Spain at a conference on exiles in North Africa from the Spanish Civil War. There were several ships that left southern Spain carrying a lot of these people, and then quite a few of them were then sent by Vichy France to these camps. And you have a network of camps that extend from Tunisia all the way across to Morocco, set up originally as just internment camps, but then they become penal colonies and labor camps under Vichy. Mm-hmm. Because either the Germans are worried about some of these, undesirables who are politically active, anti-Nazi, anti-fascist. Obviously, a lot of them are very left-wing leaning, Jewish, all sorts, Eastern Europeans who are in Europe. They get sent to North Africa as well, and there are several of them that basically people will work to death in horrendous circumstances. There's 3 or 4 camps in Algeria that come to mind. One of the ones that was probably one of the most notorious was Jelfa, and Jelfa was a camp where there were over 400 Spaniards in that camp, and over 200 established a pioneer company 361 Pioneer Company was established in April 1943 when they were liberated from their camp in early 1943. So these men had gone through a lot. Some of them had been in the camp only for a year or so as political undesirables sent by Vichy. Some of them had been in the camp since 1939 when the Spanish Civil War had finished. So, these camps were pretty horrendous. There's a lot of work ongoing now to discover more about the conditions in these camps and what happened. Quite a lot of the Spaniards who were who'd volunteered to join the French Foreign Legion and who were either in North Africa or who were sent to North Africa after Vichy took over, so after France fell in 1940, they were then put into groups and penal colonies. And one of their biggest tasks was to be part of the construction of the Trans-Saharan Railway. So basically from the north coast all the way down through Mauritania, pretty horrendous conditions there. So yeah, these camps were really bad. A lot of them were just housed in tents. They weren't in buildings. Some of them were in buildings. Some of them were forced to build the buildings that they were eventually housed in after having lived in tents, for a year or two. And I talk about it a lot in the book. It's all in chapter 5. And ironically, some of the most politically active Spaniards were in those camps, mostly because they'd been deported to North Africa by Vichy France, sent over. Agustin Droaventura, who was one of the original people who established the Spanish Ex-Servicemen's Association in the late 1950s, he was in jail along with another 200 or so who ended up in 361 Company. So yeah, I mean, pretty horrendous. Do
you think their experience in those camps influenced the way that they approached military service?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of them were fairly rebellious, but it's well documented in some of the memoirs that I've been given by the families, and I'm very grateful. A lot of the families have given me a lot of material. Some of them have just said, look, just keep it, we're never going to use it. And I have the personal memoirs of Agustin Droaventura, 8 volumes. It's incredible.
Wow.
23 kilos sent to me in a suitcase by DHL. Incredible stories. And yes, one of the things that they realized was that they were going to have to kind of, let's say, slightly bite the bullet and put politics to one side in order to continue fighting against fascism. Obviously, quite a few of them thought that the Allies would get rid of Franco as a consequence of what was going on with the Second World War. When the Allies didn't, obviously that was a bitter blow. But a lot of them put their politics to one side, saw an allegiance to the king, and joined the British Army. And I've got their their attestation papers where they sign and they put their hand to the Bible or raise their hand and say they're going to they swear an allegiance to the king and to the British Empire. So yeah, I mean, they did find it tricky, some of them, but most of them were quite happy, and they just cracked on. Basically, they were good, hard workers. The companies in which Spaniards were in North Africa, and there's several companies in which they were, three in particular had large amounts of Spaniards, but the other companies had 20, 30, 40, 50 at a time. They worked in all sorts of things. They were doing train guarding, POW, construction work, working in the ports. Some of them were in Sicily. Some of them were in Italy after that. Some of the ones who were in Sicily transferred to smoke companies. So they were providing the smoke for the actual landings. So they were one of the first few people to land on the beaches, to put smoke on the beaches. Some of them actually built some of the prisoner of war camps in which the Germans who surrendered in Algiers and in Tunis, for example. So that must have been quite gratifying for them to be able to do that and things like that. So yeah, I mean, they were very hard worker. And then obviously many of them transferred to other parts of the army as well and carried on fighting in a different way.
How did Churchill's relationship with Franco affect recruitment?
There was no issue there at all. Obviously, we're talking about needs must from a British Army perspective. Mm-hmm. Churchill would have known that there were Spaniards in the British Army because obviously he was the one who was signing off some of the plans for fighting in the Iberian Peninsula should the Germans invade the Iberian Peninsula. And this was really a big deal in 1940 and 1941 when the Germans were at their height and Britain and its empire was fighting alone in Europe, especially in North Africa. Obviously, relationships were very, let's say, difficult between Churchill's government and Franco, and there was very little communication directly. Churchill did have a link in with the aristocratic elements of Spanish society. A lot of those, sadly, were basically ejected from the country by Franco. Franco did not want to restore the monarchy, and the king in exile, Juan de Borbon, who was based in Lisbon by this stage, he was really keen to bring back a constitutional monarchy in Spain. Franco didn't want that. So, being a very strong monarchist, Churchill was not very happy with that. He did have some contact via the Duque de Alba, who was the Duke of Alba, who was the ambassador in London, who was a very strong supporter of Franco. So he did kind of communicate second, third hand via him. But overall, there's a huge concern that Spain might have joined the Axis in 1940 and 1941. So there were several plans started in order to kind of see how best anything where Gibraltar could have been taken, etc., could be dealt with. So that's why over 120 Spaniards from the No. 1 Spanish Company were trained as SOE agents to fight behind enemy lines should the Germans invade the Iberian Peninsula and try and capture Gibraltar. But at the same time, there were loads of other things going on. The British ambassador, as well as the naval attaché in Madrid, were also carrying out a lot of things in the background, a lot of espionage going on. The naval attaché, for example, he was heavily involved with the SOE and also with the Special Intelligence Service to try and get into the Spanish kind of intelligence networks. And in particular, there was a big operation that was called Operation Bribes, funnily enough, where Churchill signed off on a $150 million bribery operation in today's money to bribe Franco's generals. And this was done via a multimillionaire, Spanish multimillionaire called Juan March. He was like the Elon Musk of the day in Spain, and he'd actually made a lot of his money from arms import and export, arms sales during the First World War, and also in the Rif Wars in Spain, where Spain was involved. Spain and France were involved in Rif Wars in North Africa in the 1920s. And he also made a lot of money from tobacco. And when that started to slow down, he then set up a series of banks, and he ended up basically being Franco's banker in the 1930s and helped Franco's regime towards the end of the Spanish Civil War and in the early 1940s. But he was also on the books of British intelligence during the First World War, and he was approached during the Second World War at the beginning to be the broker to basically move this money from Britain to the United States to Spain to pay off these generals, to try and get them to persuade Franco not to join the Axis. And of course, there were lots of other reasons why the Axis wanted Spain to join, and there's lots of other reasons why Spain did not join and did not want to join. There's Canaris as well. He was very influential in Spain as well. And then there's the fact that the Spanish Civil War had a huge effect on Spain, and Spain was never going to be ready to join the Axis straight away. But Franco did toy with the idea quite a bit, and obviously met with Hitler and everything else. But when it came to kind of the relationship between Churchill and Franco, in the end, mostly due to American influence, Britain was kind of dissuaded from really kicking Franco when he was down, especially once the torch landings had happened in 1942. The United States, especially when the war finished, saw very clearly that Spain was going to be an important element to the strategy of maintaining Western Europe, and especially using it as a lily pad to launch attacks against Russia, against the Soviet Union, should the Soviet Union invade Western Europe. Basically, the Pyrenees was the first physical barrier that the the Russians were probably not going to be able to cross. So Churchill did talk a bit more warmly about Franco and the Franco regime towards the end of the war, which obviously a lot of people have jumped upon. But overall, Churchill saw the relationship with Spain basically purely linked to British interests in the war. You know, he was putting British interests first rather than Spanish interests or Franco's interests. Obviously, there's lots of people who've discussed this, and there's several books out there that discuss a lot of those things that happened. And there are little things that happen on the sidelines. You know, Wolfram, oil, blah blah blah. But ultimately, Churchill wanted British interests to be the priority, and if it meant being a bit more soft on Franco towards the end of the war, then so be it.
You talked earlier about the Spaniards that joined the SAS. There was 15 Spaniards joined the SAS. What was their role in the liberation of Europe?
Well, lots. We're talking about 8 Spaniards, maybe 9 that were in the second SAS. By early 1944, the SAS brigade had been established. You've got the originals, first SAS. Second SAS was formed in 1943. And then in 44, you've got 3rd and 4th and 5th SAS. 3rd and 4th are French and 5th SAS are Belgian. I found no Spaniards in 5th SAS, but I found Spaniards in 4th SAS, 3rd SAS, and 2nd SAS. Mm-hmm. The largest group were in 2nd SAS. There were 8 or 9 of those. The court is still out on nationality of 2 of them. I'm just confirming the nationality of one of those 2. He had Jewish links, and his great niece, I think that's right, his great niece is based in Israel. So I'm trying to see if I can find out more about him. Another one, we're not sure if he was Italian or Spanish. So we're just trying to see what we can do with that. But there were eight definitely who joined 2nd SAS who were Spanish, and 2 of those had been in the Middle East Commandos that I've talked about before, survived Cyprus, survived Crete, sorry. The other 7 or 8 were people who had joined the British Army in North Africa in 1943, went through SAS selection, and then joined the 2nd SAS. So all of those were in 2nd SAS, and the others who were in 3rd and 4th SAS had all joined the Free French army, either as legionnaires or as normal soldiers, and then had gone through the relevant parachute training / SAS selection and fought in 3rd and 4th SAS. So yeah, ultimately, some of them were already involved in a few things in North Africa and in Italy, but ultimately the majority of them, pretty much all of them, were in several operations from D-Day onwards, really, as members of the SAS. I go through it in quite a lot of detail. Those who were in the 2nd SAS really didn't get started until July 1944. Several operations behind enemy lines in central France, and then in eastern France, Operation Leuton being probably the most notorious in that regard, which had the largest casualties of SAS members in the operations in France in 1944. We have 2 Spaniards on that one. They both survived that, so they were lucky to get away. The others were in other operations, say in central France and further west, both in 2nd SAS, 3rd SAS, and 4th SAS. So they were pretty busy, basically from July all the way through to November 1944 in France. And then in December 1944, a detachment is sent from 2nd SAS to support the Americans in northern Italy, on the western side of Italy, because by this stage we've got the Gothic line which has been established, preventing the Allies in Italy from going any further. There are a lot of linkages between the SOE, some of the American special forces. There weren't as many because the SOE had a lot more contacts in Italy, and then and the SAS are sent out, and there are basically four Spaniards who were involved in operations in northern Italy, but 3 of them in particular are together on Operation Tombola, which is one of the last operations that takes place of the SAS in Italy. Those 3 were Francisco Geronimo, who changed his name to Frank Williams, because all the Spaniards changed their names to British names apart from one. And then you've got Justo Balerdi, who changed his name who Robert Bruce, and then you got Rafael Ramos, who was the only Spaniard who didn't change his name, but they called him Ralph, first name. And basically, the three of them are involved in Tombola, an audacious raid behind enemy lines to try and seek and destroy basically higher echelons of the German command. And this results in a big attack on the 51st Mountain Corps headquarters in Albinea, south of Reggio Emilia. And in that fight, Rafael Ramos is awarded the military medal for gallantry, having also walked all the way to the operation. All the others have parachuted in. He's one of 3 SAS troopers who spend 6 weeks walking through enemy lines to join Tombola via 2 other operations. And he's one of the first people into the headquarters, personally dispatches 6 German officers in the headquarters, and then evacuates an officer who's been wounded out of the building, and then with another SAS trooper puts him on a ladder and escape and evades the Germans for 3 days before joining the rest of the SAS troopers in the high mountains. So they have some amazing stories there, and it's all in the book. It's all in chapter 6. That sadly Justo Balerdi is killed a few weeks later, only 10 days or so before the war ends, at the end of April 1945, which is really sad. But yeah, I mean, they have some amazing stories to tell. And then, of course, there's others who were involved in the invasion, the crossing of the Rhine and the penetration deep into Germany, Operation Archway, quite famous operation where the SAS basically were sent forward on their jeeps to cause havoc deep into Germany. And there's several Spaniards involved in that operation, a mix of 1st and 2nd SAS in that operation. But yeah, no, some amazing operations there.
Because we've mentioned it earlier about the language barrier.
Yep.
Did the language barrier ever affect combat at all?
As far as I know, no. Mostly because at the lowest tactical level, they were commanded by other Spaniards. So where obviously it could have proved problematic was in things like the Commandos and the SAS, but it does not seem to have been the case. Because a lot of these people were fully integrated, their English obviously got better as the war went along. So as far as I know, no. But I mean, I do talk about some of the issues with the language, but it's mostly with the Pioneer Corps companies in North Africa, where even the NCOs at the beginning in 1943, their English is just appalling. And yeah, the officers do have real language issues, but by the end of the war, there's no issues. I mean, by the end of the war, some of the company commanders are Spanish speakers from South America, or expats, and some of the sergeant majors are Spaniards who've come through the ranks in the companies. So yeah, I mean, yeah, there are issues, but I don't think it actually affects them in combat.
And did the Spanish bring anything unique to the British Army?
Yeah, I mean, it is said they were not great shots. However, they were really good with the knife. So when the Commandos, they were used specifically for night operations, and there are several instances. I quote one of them in the book in chapter 4 about them being used for night patrols, taking out sentries in Somalia. That's very well known. So they were very good at that. They were also really good at hand-to-hand combat. They were able to really get stuck in with that. They also had some amazing endurance. Don't forget, a lot of them came from a very hot climate, so they were used to hardship, especially in North Africa and the Middle East. A lot of them had been in the French Foreign Legion, so they were used to long marches. So by the time they joined the British Army, Middle East Commandos, for example, carrying weight long distances, 30, 40 miles in a day, not an issue. They had no problems at all. So they were able to kind of endure, bearing in mind some of these people had literally crossed the desert after deserting from the French Foreign Legion in Syria and Lebanon to join the British Army. So they were able to kind of do that. I mean, there's a prime example of, for example, Francisco Geronimo Frank Williams, who joins the SAS. He escapes and evades in Crete after the fall of Crete for 11 months on his own. He joins other people, and I talk about that a bit as well in in the SAS chapter, in chapter 6. It's an incredible story. So some of these people have amazing endurance. And the final thing I think I would say is, and this is mentioned quite a lot, is they're able to live off the land a lot better than the British troops. There's several instances of them living off the land in Crete, in North Africa, in Italy, and they're able to magic up animals or track animals down and find them or steal them from somewhere, whatever they're able to do. Even Evelyn Waugh, who was the intelligence officer in Lay Force on Crete, the Middle East Commandos became Lay Force. He talks about them making this amazing suckling pig or suckling lamb or something that they've come across, and so they're able to live the land. So yeah, I think they did bring a lot, and a lot of bravery. If you look at some of the mentions in dispatches and the military medals, I talk about the 3 military medals I've tracked down so far in the book. They were pretty brave people as well.
Very,
so yeah.
very. And what was the mood at the end of the war when they found that Franco was still in charge?
A very difficult situation for them. It was a bit of disappointment, I think. Not for all of them. I think some of them had already decided, okay, whatever happens, I'm going to carry on fighting, blah, blah, blah. But some of them, they were bitterly disappointed. It took them a while. I mean, the pressure really was on, at the end of the war, 45, 46, 47. That's when the Franco regime really had a lot of pressure on it. But the international community didn't necessarily act fully on it. And so in that period, a lot of the Spaniards who had served in the British Army knew that they had to really try and sort themselves out and establish some sort of life. They had to kind of start all over again. So, even though they were bitterly disappointed, they carried on. They had to carry on. Some of them ended up going to Mexico because they just thought, well, there's no point in staying in Europe anymore. The Mexican government set up a process for Spanish Republican exiles and gave them Spanish nationality. But obviously, that was mostly for the communists and the socialists. If you were an anarchist, it was difficult to get the funding. You had to pay your own way to get to Mexico. So there were funds for it, but it was mostly from the socialist and the communist side rather than the anarchist side. So a lot of the Spaniards who were in Britain, it was never going to be that easy for them to do that. So a lot of them ended up staying in Britain.
Did they feel betrayed by the Allies that Franco was still in charge?
I think some of them did, definitely. But it's amazing how they got over it quite quick. They were able to settle down and find a life quite quickly. Many of them get jobs, move to places. I mean, a lot of them met women, local women, settled down in the areas where they were demobbed. So you've got people demobbing in the Midlands, people demobbing in the Southwest. People demobbing in London, people demobbing in the North. And then a lot of them also, who were groups of friends, also moved later on as well, maybe a year or so later, to find work. It's a good example. It's a bit of a Spanish Republican group who all served mostly in the Middle East Commandos, who moved to the northeast and got jobs in Middlesbrough, for example, working in the steel there. About 7 or 8 of them. So you've got some examples there. So yeah, when they just realised that they had to crack on, and some of them, especially the ones who'd been in Britain for a while, number one Spanish companies, a prime example, we're talking about over 250. Some of them had met British women during the war and had decided to settle down with them anyway. So their lives were already in Britain; they were never going to leave. So even though they were disappointed, they kind of cracked on and made life for themselves. Some of them were able to bring their families over. Some of them who had wives and children back in Spain, once they were given authority to apply for British citizenship after 1947, they were also allowed to bring their families over. Some of them did that. There's quite a few amazing stories there on that, and I talk about those in the book as well. But yeah, many of them had to start from scratch.
And as a British Army officer, how easy was it to track down over 100 families?
Not easy. It took me 8 years, 8 years to do all the research for this book. 9 years if you include the work I then did between the English version and the Spanish version, because the Spanish version is 100 pages bigger than the English version, and it has more photos because as a consequence of the Spanish version, I ended up being contacted by more families with more stories. And actually, it was great because I ended up being in a situation where I was able to kind of close some of the stories properly, which is really good. The English version still covers 90% of the story, so that's good. I mean, I say 90% of the story. There's still a lot to discover about these men, so that there will be a second edition at some point when I've gathered more information. But ultimately, it was more about the families leading me on to other families. So oh yeah, because I have a standard set of questions when I sit down and quiz a family. Can you tell me about this? Can you tell me about what do they do in Spanish Civil War? Where in Spain were they from? Do you have any relations in Spain? Do you know what they did in the Spanish Civil War? Do you know what happened after that? How did they end up in the British Army? Blah, blah, blah. Do you have any photos? Do you have any documents? What happened at the end of the war? Where did they settle down? Where did they marry where did they get married to your mom? Blah, blah, blah. Can you tell me more about, did they get involved in the Spanish Ex-Servicemen's Association, for example? Because that got established in the late 50s, and a lot of people met up. They had a newsletter, and people, even though they were in different parts of the country, they made an effort, put a small something into it. Spanish Number One Company had reunions every year, for example. So a lot of these families kept in touch. And then, and one of the questions, of course, is, do you know any other families, and can you pass me on their details? So one family leads on to another, leads on to another. And before you know it, you've met 50, and you've got enough material, along with all the stuff that you find from the archives, the National Archives, Imperial War Museum, books, audio interviews in the Imperial War Museum Photo Archive, National Army Museum, archives in Spain, archives in France. That's why it took me so long, because I was really keen to make sure I tried to provide as much background information as I could to everything. Most of the stories have two or three, not I wouldn't call them facts, but two or three sources to them up. So for example, the testimony of somebody from a diary is backed up by another diary, backed up maybe by the war diary of the unit. And if they all kind of more or less coincide, then I know I'm on the right track, kind of thing. So it took me a long time, but yeah, it's great. And that's one of the reasons why we're re-establishing the Spanish Ex-Servicemen's Association, is because we've gathered a head of steam now. And one of the big things that happened when I launched the book, the main launch in UK was at the National Army Museum in September 2024. And I was able to meet loads of the families that I've been speaking to on the internet, Zoom and email and WhatsApp and, Messenger and all this stuff. And ultimately they all turned up. And one of the first questions at the end of my presentation was, why don't these people have a memorial? Why don't they have a monument? They all served the British Army. Surely they should have some sort of memorial. And that's one of the reasons why we've re-established the Spanish Ex-Servicemen's Association this year, is because we're now going to start a campaign to establish a monument to the National Memorial Arboretum. That's our plan. Hopefully it'll come off. It's a long road. It's going to take a couple of years to sort out. But we've got a design. We know what we want. The Spanish Ex-Servicemen's Association is the organisation that will support this. You'll find the Spanish Ex-Servicemen's Association on Instagram and on Facebook. We are going to have a website by the end of August, which will basically be sesa.org.uk. And basically, it's really going to be about getting the families together again, and at the same time promoting and raising money for the monument. So the families have been brilliant. They've been really good, and they've really given me a lot of their time and a lot of their material, and they've been very generous with a lot of the things they've done. And I can't complain really at all. They're very grateful that I've gone out of my way to try and tell this story. It's important. Yeah.
Very, very important. All the stories that come out are exceedingly important. We need to understand what happened. We need to understand the people who made it happen.
Yeah.
So,
No, you're right. It's also, in my eyes, it's also part and parcel of the traditions of the British Army, where we have these, you can see the British Army today. We have people from the Commonwealth and the British Army.
yeah.
Well, in the Second World War, it was bigger than that. The army was the British Army of the Commonwealth, etc., etc. And it took on a lot of these people, and a lot of these people served with distinction, in British uniform. And these some of the Spaniards were part of that, part of that distinction, that serving with distinction. So I think we owe it to them to tell their
Yeah.
story. Hopefully we'll get this monument established, and we'll have a nice big opening ceremony in a couple of years, and we'll keep the association going with the families, and basically make sure that the story's told. I mean, in Spain, it's gathered a lot of interest. I mean, we've just entered the 90th anniversary of the beginning of the Spanish Civil War, so it's still a bit of an open wound in Spain. There's still a lot of politicization of things in Spain. Right and left are very, very, very at each other's throats in Spain, and the Spanish Civil War is definitely a wound that hasn't been healed. But also the history of Spaniards outside of Spain after the Spanish Civil War is a story that needs to be told.
Yeah.
A lot of people have told the story of Spaniards who served for the French and all of that. And there's lots of other things that the Spaniards did during the Second World War and beyond. And the Spaniards who served in the British Army are just part of that historical memory, as they call it, memoria histórica. It's just part of that, but it's a small part. And I was very lucky. The Spanish government, the Spanish Ministry of Culture, had an exhibition this year in Madrid, just by the Royal Palace, in the gardens of the Royal Palace, between February and June, and it was all about the title was La Nueve, the ninth company, and there was a company that served in Leclerc's Second Armored Division that was part of the liberation of Paris. But actually, the exhibition wasn't just about them; it was also telling the story of Spaniards who served and who fought fascism and the Axis during the Second World War.
Mm-hmm.
And I was very grateful to be approached to write a chapter of the catalogue of this exhibition. And I was invited to the opening, and I met the Minister for Culture and everything else.
Wow.
So I feel as if, even though the book obviously has done well in Spain and has kind of found quite a lot of interest, for me, being asked to write that chapter and be part of that exhibition was a huge step. And there are plenty of other things that are going to happen over the next couple of years during the Spanish Civil War anniversaries that are coming up until 1939, and obviously 2029 will be the 90th anniversary of the end of the Spanish Civil War, and then that's really when my story starts as such, although it starts before the Spanish Civil War, obviously, because a lot of these people were involved in things well before the Spanish Civil War kicked off. But ultimately, I've been very lucky in that way to be part of this overall story. Spanish radio, I've been on like Spanish equivalent of BBC Radio 4, all of these amazing things. I might have an exhibition next year. I get asked, to talk regularly, and it's great. It's really good. And I feel very fortunate to be able to tell the story of these people, because it's a story that needs to be told. And it's opened up a lot of avenues. I've got lots of other projects in the pipeline. Our next big project is going to be on the Middle East Commandos, with a Spanish twist, obviously, because the Spaniards were involved a little bit, but it'll be the wider story of the Middle East Commandos. I'm also looking at writing some work on stuff linked to with the Spanish Civil War and things like that. So there's some, and obviously carrying on writing some more some more books on the Spaniards who served in the British Army, special forces, commandos, blah blah blah. So there's plenty to keep me going well into my retirement in a couple of years' time.
Well, when you do get those books going, come back on and talk about them.
Oh yeah, definitely. That would be a real, it'd be really good fun. I'll enjoy that, definitely.
Awesome. It's been really good talking to you today. And from your book, Churchill's Spaniards, I'll put a link down below so everybody can grab a copy of that.
Yeah.
And that is a really, really good read. It's exceedingly interesting about these heroes that just don't get a mention, really.
Yeah, very much so. Yeah, and
So,
thank you for inviting me on the program. And I hope everybody will have a look at getting the book if they can, and also look at following the Spanish Exercises Association on Instagram, and the website will be up soon as well. And of course,
definitely.
eventually, once we've got the program up and running, end of August, early September, try and see if you can make a donation to help with the monument.
Well, I'll put their Instagram down below
That would be
as well,
brilliant. Yeah,
so everybody
yeah,
can click
yeah.
on that and get support in that.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. And
Thank you.
yeah, I look forward to talking to you again in the future. It'd be great fun.
Okay, you take care now.
Muchas gracias.
Bye bye.
Adiós.